Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of the Exodus Project. I'm your host, Steve Eisenhower. I am joined with good friend, Rabbi Tovia Singer, straight from the Holy Land, author of the 2-volume book set, Let's Get Biblical, available in the description. Please check that out. Rabbi, how are you doing?
Hey, really well, considering very, very well. Mild winter here in Jerusalem, but I imagine the weather is better here than it is where you are. So we're doing good.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, today it was in the 60s. I
I don't
almost
want to
couldn't
hear
believe
that.
it.
I don't want to
Yeah.
hear that. Don't tell me that. I don't want to hear that. It's not that cold. I mean, Jerusalem actually was in the 60s, but we like to think there's much better weather than, but it's good. It's good.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, Rabbi, today I want to really touch on the themes in the New Testament of, supersessionism, how these things get their legs, things that really can't be ignored. Um, and the Christian, their most important holiday is, a month away, right? And I'd like to begin with, you see major events in the New Testament occurring on Jewish holidays, right? I mean, you see Jesus's death, tearing of the veil on Passover. You see his resurrection kind of replacing first fruits. You see the giving of the Holy Spirit on Shavuos, right? All these major Christian events that are really superseding the most pivotal event in Jewish history, right? The Exodus and ultimately the Sinai revelation. So what in your opinion, do you see it that way? Do you see that it's a intentional replacing or superseding of Judaism with what Jesus did on the cross?
Fundamentally so. That means you mentioned, you touched on many features that are prominent in the Christian Bible. The tearing of the veil in the Passion narratives. That people get all caught up in when did the veil get torn. It really isn't important. What is critical is that the separation between Jew and Gentile has been torn down.
Right.
The parable of Jesus cursing the fig tree. It's a very strange story that we find in the 11th chapter. It's in the Gospels, but in
Sure.
Mark 11 is an example that Jesus encounters a fig tree, and it wasn't the season for it to give its figs, and
Mhm.
he curses it, and then he comes back with his disciples, and the fig tree withered away, and it will never give fruit. Like, what kind of story is that? And all the disciples were amazed. Like, what is that? It's like, it's an insane story that doesn't make any sense. But what it is that Israel has been cursed, and the
Sure.
church is the new Israel. Now, bear in mind that all the Gospels are written after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Right.
So all the Gospels are writing these stories as though they're written at the time, but they're written after it happened. They're written after 9/11. So
Right.
they're able
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Hmm.
right. So they're able to interpret the destruction of Yerushalayim in Mark chapter 13 as an example,
Right.
in the Olivet Discourse as an example, as though Jesus was predicting all this.
Exactly.
And in truth, all the church fathers said with one voice. It's funny that the church fathers didn't agree on anything. They
Yeah, but they
fought with
agreed on
each
one thing.
other.
Yeah.
This is something really crazy. So, as church fathers had unflattering things to say about Jews,
Hmm.
but they said much more nasty things about each other. they really, they
Right.
really went on it. When I say church fathers, I'm talking all of them, Tertullian, Origen. They were ripping each other apart.
Hmm.
But there were certain pieces they couldn't agree on anything: the nature, the deity of Jesus, and they couldn't agree on Easter, if Easter should be celebrated on Passover or not Passover. They fought on everything. But
Right.
the one thing they all said with one voice was that temple was destroyed as a signal, as a symbol of God's displeasure or rejection of Israel, and that Jesus is the new temple, and
Mhm.
the Jews would be either destroyed or languish in exile as a symbol, as a monument to their sin of committing deicide. We
Okay.
have a sermon written by Melito, very
Yep.
early church father, that's second century. He
Yeah.
goes
Melito of
on and
Sardis.
on.
Hmm.
Yeah, he goes on and on about the Jews. That theme never changed. That's why the church never sought to rebuild or do anything with the Temple Mount. The
Right.
Muslims did. The
Hmm.
church didn't want it. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which really was a temple probably to Apollo. It was one of the Greek gods, um, which is I can walk there in 20 minutes. Uh, but the Temple Mount was to lie in ruins, and in fact, Augustine, um, probably the most important church father, certainly the most important church father, in his City of God, his magnum opus,
Hmm.
says he addresses a question, that is, why are the Jews still here? Like,
Hmm.
why? He means if God has broken his covenant with the Jews because of their unbelief and treachery and perfidious nature, then why are they here? See, the Hebrew Bible says the Jews would always be here. Nothing happened to destroy the Jews. So many questions arose. One of them was, then why are the Jews still here? Like the
Right.
Canaanites are not here, the Girgashim, the Yevusim, all the ancient people, the Philistines, all these nations all disappeared. The Jews are still here. Why are the Jews here? Augustine had to address many questions. He had to address the question of why was Rome destroyed, sacked in 410, not long after Rome became Christian. Like, how did
Right.
that happen?
Exactly.
So his point was that in fact the Jews are God preserves the Jews now so that they in a state of being degraded, and that all the world should see the Jew and to see what happens to people
Hmm.
that reject the Lord. But the
Right.
book of Hebrews is interesting because the book of Hebrews, it was written while the temple still stood. The book of Hebrews probably written 64. So it was written even before the war with Rome began in 66. So the book of Hebrews actually says that there is something new going to happen. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets and many times in various ways. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his son, who he appointed heir to all things, and through whom he has made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by the powerful word. And then Hebrews takes off to that Jesus is superior to the angels, which is
Hmm.
mind blowing because
Right.
the church says that Jesus was the angel
Yeah.
Lord. Hebrews says no, he's not, and he's greater than
Right.
Moses, Joshua, high priest. He's above everything. But the book of Hebrews was written while there was competition. The temple was actually standing and functioning. So, yeah, so the Christian Bible is repeatedly, Paul is doing this differently
Hmm.
in Romans as an example, um, where he's saying that God is done with Israel. One caveat, and that is that the book of Romans is written for a mixed audience.
Sure.
The book
Of
of
course.
Romans is written, Paul is writing to people he has not met in Rome. He hadn't yet visited Rome. So when Paul writes that book, he's very careful And therefore, Paul will say everything. Paul will say that the Jews are special and chosen, but the Paul will say, but who is a real Jew? Is it those who keep the law, or is it those who, is it not really
Right,
the real
exactly.
Jew? So he's
Hmm.
doing everything, and that confuses people. Romans 11, certainly Paul is saying that the physical Jews are ultimately saved and the Gentiles are only grafted in, and the unbelief of the Jews is supernatural to um, so that if the Gentiles are grafted in, that would ignite a jealousy among Jews. So he's all
Right.
over the place, and that's why they're both the people who believe replacement theology and those who reject that idea, dispensationalists, all are using the same text in
Right.
Romans.
Right. And what's funny is dispensationalists, even though they will openly say, yes, we reject replacement theology, etc., I think you'd be hard pressed to find one that would say that every Jew shouldn't be a Christian. Like they would
Right.
expect
Well,
Jews to be Christians.
right. That's a very important point. So let no one be confused here. Dispensationalists believe that if Jews don't believe in Jesus, they're going to hell.
They're not saved. Exactly. Exactly.
They're going to hell. I mean, they're going to hell if they don't believe it. They don't believe, the dispensationalists believe that the only way to be saved is to be a Christian. The only way to
Right.
avoid the
Right.
fires of hell is a Christian. They're just talking about, are the Jews saved as a nation, corporate Israel, for God's purpose, and has a role at the end of days return to the land of
Exactly.
Israel.
Right.
Their conversion triggers the second coming of Christ. But they believe only the church is the only covenant through which one could be saved. Now, there is I would call it fringe. There are some outliers who do hold a dual covenant
Dual
theology.
covenant theology. Sure.
Yeah, there are some guys. Most famous guys is John Hagee. Although because he got so much pushback, he doesn't talk about it anymore. There are the dual covenant guys who think that actually Jesus is not here for Jews. The Jews are just keeping Torah, keeping mitzvahs, and that's how they're saved.
Right.
But that's a complete outlier. That's not,
Sure.
like 1% of evangelicals believe that.
Right. And another interesting point that I think a lot of people gloss over, um, and it's another one of these themes, this idea of supersessionism is the bride of Christ, right? That the church is Jesus's bride, really like a supersession of like what we see in Shir Hashirim, right? That Israel is the bride
Mhm.
of Hashem, right? And they have this loving relationship. Um, but then in comes the New Testament, and now the church is the bride of Christ or the bride of God, however you want to interpret it in that way. Do you see that as a similar tie-in to what we've just been going over?
Yeah, it's the response to Isaiah 54. Isaiah 54 is famous. It follows a very famous chapter where Israel is spoken of in the singular, who is despised and rejected, and the nations are shocked. The enemies of Israel, the former enemies of Israel, confess their error, their mistake, and it contains a gorgeous soliloquy. Isaiah 54, God is now speaking of Israel as his wife,
Hmm.
and he says there, and he says to the barren woman who has never born a child, burst into song, you who were never in labor, because more are the children of the less desolate woman than her who has a husband. And in fact, it is the Almighty, for your Maker is your husband, Lord, Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. And it goes on, no weapon shaped, formed against you will succeed. Here we have Israel spoken of as afflicted, verse 11, but no weapon formed against you will succeed. I should point out that today, people who subscribe to replacement theology are largely not that involved in Jewish evangelism. And
Right.
almost everyone who's out there trying to convert Jews, almost all of them are dispensationalists. Almost all of them
Sure.
are.
Of course.
There are exceptions, but they're not many. So
And
I don't
that's kind of
actually,
the
yeah,
messianic the messianic anomaly,
Right.
right, is that they all agree that for a Jew to not go to hell, as you had pointed out, you have to believe in Jesus, but yet they want to cling to all these Jewish icons and symbols and services in a messianic church,
Right.
right? So it's really an anomaly, you know.
Right. Right. They want that was the idea. The idea that was developed in the early 70s was that Jewish people don't want to convert to Christianity. They don't want to stop being Jewish. They're proud of their Jewish identity. And you understand the 67 war, which I remember as a child, fueled an enormous amount of pride. It was a tectonic event in history. And it just changed the map in every way. I don't mean the map of Israel. It just changed the way everyone thought.
Mhm.
So at that point, people were very proud to be Jewish. I mean, it really had a very big effect on the way Jews viewed themselves and the way the world viewed Jewish people. Jewish people were very proud, and here
Right.
they were up against insurmountable odds, and then Israel defeats Arab enemies, armies from all directions, and the war was really over within 2 hours. Um, so it was so shocking, and during the '67 war, we didn't really know exactly what was going on,
Mhm.
but after the war was over, all the information came out. So there was there was just people were very proud, and Christians were very dispensations were just shocked. People were just blown away. And most importantly, Jerusalem was now in Jewish hands. Put that into context that at that time, to say that you're no longer Jewish wouldn't have made any sense to people because we were very proud to be Jewish. That
Mhm.
did play a role. That played a very important role. Yeah.
And with that point in mind, I'd like to segue into if God truly wanted the Jews to be Christians, why that intentional supernatural blindness that we all hear about? Like why the scales? Why the scales over the eyes of the Jew?
In Second Corinthians. So uh, first of all, this is absolutely mind blowing. The viewer, must understand that the whole point of the Messianic age is the Gentiles realize that the Jews all along were correct, and that all the world embraces the Jewish people and says, "Now we know that God is with you, and the knowledge of God covers the world as the water covers the sea." The notion that there should be a mass blindness as a result of the coming of the Messiah is just so mind blowing. It would be as outrageous as saying that the head of Hamas is the chief rabbi of Israel. It just would what like it just it's be like saying that Yasser Arafat was the greatest rabbi who ever lived. It's not that it's not accurate or not correct or it misses the mark. It means that you're on another universe.
Yeah,
You have.
right.
Do you understand what I'm saying? It
Of
means
course,
of
yeah.
all the messianic prophecies, the most central that really is the underpinning of all messianic prophecies that everyone understands at the end of days, they know the
Hmm.
truth. And they come
Right.
to the Jews and say, Jeremiah 16, verse 19, the Gentiles will come to you and say, we blew
Hmm.
it. How can a man make unto themselves gods when they are not? They'll be shocked. They'll cover their mouths in bewilderment and say to the Jews, now we know that God is with you. Take us with you. I mean, that the whole
Right.
point
Right.
is in the Messianic age, it's not there's an absence of knowledge. There's a fullness of knowledge that's universal. It's just the opposite of
Hmm.
Paul's message that there's some grand mystery. Because what Paul is using is Gnosticism. This is
Hmm.
an
Hmm.
ancient, toxic, spiritual cancer that was a theme in the pagan religions, and that is that this world was a horrible world built by, let's say, in Neoplatonic terms, a demiurge. In the ancient world, people suffered miserably. Steve, I don't know if modern medicine didn't exist, would you be alive? Would your wife be alive? I don't
Probably
know.
not. Probably not.
You'd be dead. Probably be dead. In misery. People were miserable in the ancient world, just miserable. And death was ubiquitous. I mean, people, you have to understand this point. Today, you could fly. I mean, it's just, the ancient world was filled with mystery. They didn't know what an earthquake was. They thought the gods were angry. They didn't know what lightning was. They didn't know any of these things. They had no clue. And moreover, the forces in the world didn't. What does lightning have to do with what does an earthquake have to do with a tsunami? They just didn't know. So they thought the gods were angry. Only Judaism said there's one God. All these forces are really coming from the one God. So this was a bad place.
Right.
Created by a bad God, in contrast to the God who created the heavens that was just absolutely perfect. And then, how do you get out of this place? Who are you? How'd you get here? And how do you escape? And you needed special gnosis, special knowledge. That's what Paul's is peddling in. There's nothing like this. It's all pure avodah zarah. And that's what the ancient world was. The ancient world was, you have to have special knowledge. In Tanakh, it's no, everyone will know. It's universal. Now, why does Paul say that the Jews had scales over their eyes or veils over their eyes, that they're blinded? Why does he say this? Because he is addressing a problem. He's addressing a conundrum. If it's so clear, if it's so obvious, why don't the Jews believe this?
Right. Damage control.
This is a big issue, Steve. Like, many people watching this show right now have been Christians and know that one of the big questions that come up with pastors is, if this is so obvious to you, why don't Jews believe in Jesus? Like, why do they reject Jesus? If you have an anti-Semitic flair, you just go there, a bunch of devils. Like, but if you're not, if you don't really dislike Jews, and you've had a good, then you really go like, what the heck is wrong with these people? All right, so secular Jews, the guys in Hollywood, I get it. They're not religious. But why aren't religious Jews who are very devoted to their religion? Why don't they? So then Paul has to come with that there's a supernatural reason why the Jews don't believe. But it's just the opposite. The point of the Messianic age is that everyone knows the truth. And the chief role of the Messiah is to be a judge, v'shafat beino amim. He will give heichacha, rebuke to the nations. He won't judge people after the sight of his eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11. This is what goes on. Paul is explaining away a problem. Why don't the Jews believe it? Supernatural.
Right. And how did it miss him? How did it miss the disciples? Right. For some reason, there's just this in-group that doesn't get the scales, but every other Jew miraculously does, right? It's interesting.
Right. So it has to be. Well, I thought you were going in a different direction on this. So I want to sort of take that in two directions. So Paul actually is saying that his revelation is superior to the other disciples, and he didn't get it in. He didn't get it in Jerusalem. Paul saw other Christians as the greater threat to him, and he is berating the church in Jerusalem. I spent a couple of weeks with the brother of Jesus. Yeah, I did. But if you look in Acts, Paul is visiting Jerusalem frequently. In Paul's letters.
And often he stands down to James. If we can take Acts at face value, right?
Acts is more friendly, but Paul is really referring to, in 2 Corinthians, he's referring to, in Galatians, in his letters, he's saying the so-called pillars of the church. He really is quite disdainful of them, because he's saying that I have revelation, Ephesians 3, that came directly to me and through me, and which is incredible, because missionaries insist that it's very plain in the Hebrew Bible that the Messiah will suffer and die. So, like, what's the big mystery if it's the 365 prophecies? Paul doesn't care. Now, one other thing, you touched on something that I didn't expect it to. So here we see where the Reformed theology comes from. In that, if man is so sinful, this is a theme that's pounded in Paul's letters, it is even where you don't expect it to be. I'll just say this one thing. In the places where you least expect it to be, it's there, but people don't see it.
Right.
Even, let me make this case that I've never made, but I think about a lot. Even in the most pronomian places of the Christian Bible, like the Sermon on the Mount, which everyone quotes, do not think that I come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. No one changed one jot or tittle the law, anyone can leave the kingdom of heaven. There is a caveat which people miss. And it's the you have heard, this is in Matthew 5, you have heard that if you commit adultery,
Right.
I say unto you, even if you feel adultery in your heart, you've already committed adultery.
Right.
Even if you're just angry, you already murdered somebody. What is
Right.
that? What the heck is that? So people miss that point, but this is even more powerful than Paul. Now, this should, if you, the viewer, are listening carefully, this should blow you away. This stuff from the Sermon on the Mount, which people view as the most pro-Torah text in all of the New Testament, is really the most powerful anti-Torah text, because what it's saying after it gives lip service, it says, actually, if you just have lust in your heart, you've committed adultery. If you look at a woman in lust, you've already committed adultery. If you feel anger at somebody, you're already a murderer. Well, then you're finished, right? Then you're finished.
Right.
In Judaism, if you feel if you feel attracted to somebody who you're not supposed to be with, and you say, look, she's very pretty, look, he's very handsome, but Hashem, I'm not going to do it. So that person's considered righteous. A person is angry at someone, and the person says, but Hashem says, don't take revenge. I'm not going to do it. So that person is great. But what Jesus, we are told, is saying is no. That means he's saying you're finished, you're fried, you have, there's no chance. So really, the most antinomian text in the Christian Bible is where people least suspect they were discovered, and that's in the Sermon on the Mount, because it's in the middle of storytelling and it's appealing on a very primitive level, in the fundamental way. When you feel tempted and you resist that temptation, you're a much better person than a person who's never tempted. Like, I've never been tempted to drink, get drunk. I just don't like. I mean, I like a glass of wine's fine. I don't go for that. Those kind of things don't interest me. All this kind of crazy stuff doesn't interest me. God's not going to reward me. I would never eat lobster, even if God said you can, because it looks disgusting to me. They say it tastes good. I don't know.
Around on your plate.
It's gross. You want to call an exterminator. To me, it's disgusting. It's like who?
But what's interesting, Rabbi, you brought up the Sermon on the Mount, and I really think that ties into the Christian idea that all sin is punishable by death, because what he mentions, adultery and murder, those are chayav misa, right? But yet he's saying, even if these are just thoughts, internalized sins, you're punishable on death. So it's, and I think that the wages of sin is death, that whole Christian idea, and that's necessitates Jesus's death for you. And it's just, once again, as you said, this antinomian in what seems to be a pronomian place.
Right. This is what everyone misses. And in fact, this is, when people say all sin is the same, which Paul advances this idea, which is, we would never apply this in our world that we live in. I don't know exactly where you live, Steve. I know you live in the United States, right? You would really be bothered if people who were given a speeding violation were thrown to prison for 40 years. You would say, what the heck is going on? What kind of universe is that? I mean, people are punished. You would not want 8-year-olds to be punished in the same way that adults would be punished. I mean, we all have that sense of justice, and we don't hold people accountable who just don't know any better. But God is this psychopath maniac who's just angry, an old man who's suffering from some sort of dementia, who's just angry at everybody. And in truth, why does this work? See, we have to ask the question, why does this work? Because who is your worst critic? Look in the mirror.
Mhm.
Who is the one, and I'm speaking to you, the viewer, who is the one that feels most unattractive? Is you the one who thinks that most critical of the way you look and feel about yourself, and people feel deep down, God must be really angry at me. He really must be hating my guts because I've had these thoughts. You see, and he
Right.
knows every thought I've had. So I'm done. I'm fried. I'm smoke. I'm done. And that's where Christianity is there.
It thrives.
Christianity
Yeah.
is there to say you can't do it. Um it weaponizes that. It uses that the low self-esteem, which is our worst character feature of our character. I mean, every stupid mistake you've ever made in your life was because your self-esteem was low. The
Sure.
dumbest things we've all done is because our self-esteem was low. So one of our lousy features is low self-esteem. Every bad decision comes from low self-esteem. You marry the wrong person because you think no one who else is going to marry me. Every stupid thing is all the bad decisions come from low self-esteem. But what is our other vice? Other vice is arrogance.
Sure.
Arrogance. And Christianity delivers the drug there too and says, if
Hmm.
you become a Christian, God speaks through you. You're a prophet. Like the Lord, the Lord speaks to me, and He laid it on my heart. So
Right.
now it's like both, like you're getting an IV into both veins. Both your low self-esteem is being addressed by saying you really can't do it,
Right.
physically do
And the
it,
ego.
and
Yeah.
and the ego, bingo, and it's just mainline. That's really, and you hear that in the testimonials constantly. Why the testimonials? I was drunk, I was on alcohol, I was on drugs, I was a prostitute, I was this, that, and I found you. Why? Why don't you meet people who convert to Judaism who become B'nai Noach saying I was on drugs and I found Moses? We don't
Right.
encounter that.
You're
That
right. Yeah. Hmm.
it delivers. So it's the most fiercely anti-Nomian texts really are where we would least expect it, and that is in the Sermon on the Mount, where
Yeah.
it's it slips in. If you
Hmm.
feel lust in your heart, you committed adultery, so then you're fried,
Yep.
you're smoked, but then you can't do it,
Sure.
and that's in there, and bingo, you're done.
Yeah. So to segue into one final point, and I really think it's like the New Testament's culmination of these things, it then demonizes the Jews, right? The
Yes.
synagogue of
Mhm.
Satan, you're
Yes.
only the children of your father, the devil, and all these just
Yes.
horrible things. And you
Right.
see that a lot in the Johannine literature, right? So
Yes, that's
I,
correct.
I really find that it's like we understand that's the later stuff to come along, and it's being approached in a way, well, they know the truth, but they reject it anyway.
Yes, that's correct. I'll tell you something I never said on air. I don't think so. There's an intriguing theme. I don't know if I've ever shared it, but I think about this a lot. Well, actually, this idea that the Jews are the devil or the enemies of God is found in Paul. And then it's not really in the synoptic gospels. It is in the storytelling, but not the. But Paul literally says the Jews killed the Lord Jesus Christ, their own prophets. It's the first thing.
Right.
And also, so we find it in Paul, and then it then pops up, as you said, in Joannian texts, like Revelation 2:9 and 3:9,
Yep. Yep.
that the Jews are really this, and it's the synagogue of Satan. Pop, and it's interesting that also the Pauline notion that Jesus is our Passover, 1 Corinthians 5:7,
Hmm.
also leaps over the synoptic gospel and metastasizes to the Joannian text. So you'll find it in John 1:29, 136. You'll find it in Revelation chapter 5. Well, it's
Hmm.
actually all over the place that Jesus is the Lamb. So
Right.
it sort of metastasizes from the lungs to the lymph nodes, but skips a lot of organs in between.
Right, sure.
That outrageous kind of stuff. The Synoptic Gospels are very anti-Semitic, but they're anti-Semitic in storytelling, not these just absolute dogmatic statements about the Jews. So it's one of the intriguing elements in the Christian Bible where there's a lot of borrowing going on. These are not accidents.
Yeah. Yeah. The only real spot I can think of would be the woe to the Pharisees monologue, right? Where it's talking also again about killing all the prophets and so on and so forth. But even there, it says that they sit in the seat of Moses and you need to listen to what they say. So once again, you're finding kind of like incriminating charges mixed in with pronomian ideas, just like you said on the Sermon of the Mount.
Right. So the Matthew 23. So that's a Q source. So in Matthew 23 as an example, so it's simply saying the Jews did all these things. We killed we killed everybody. we killed Abel. I'm not kidding.
Yeah. Abel. Right. Yeah.
The Jews, we are responsible for the blood of Abel. Really? I don't know. My reading of Genesis 4 is a little different.
It says you come from Chase. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, how did that happen? Like, what? It's like, people think that Jews are crazy for not being Christians. You understand? If you, the Christian, understand what you're reading, you wouldn't. To the righteous blood of Zechariah, it says Berachai in verse 35 of 23. Right. But there it's saying that you've done everything. You're for everything. Right. It says it that way, but it's different. That means in First Thessalonians, he's saying, the Jews have. It incorporates the charge that the Jews have, killed everybody, killed Jesus, killed their own prophets. Right, very Matthew 23, but are contrary to mankind, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles. That's very strong. And just bear in mind, First Thessalonians probably was written in 49, may have been written in 49. It's very, very early. For that to appear so early and then explode in Joannian texts is it's a very striking theme that you have ideas in Pauline literature, and then it emerges again in Joannian literature. So I'm not the first person in the world to notice this. It's something that's very striking. Sure. Right. But that's what this does. I'll have to say this to Christians who don't feel anti-Semitic. Now, no Christian ever says an anti-Semite, because it's not socially acceptable. Like, people don't talk that way. No one, you can't say it because people look at you like you're an idiot. But if a Christian really has no ill feeling towards Jewish people, so it really says a lot about them, because I wonder if I had been raised in the Christian world and read these texts and I was exposed to this Christian stuff, to the New Testament, I can understand how someone can and not feel some antipathy towards Jews, which explains away my childhood in that it's true, this was in highly gentrified in Brooklyn, New York, but I never encountered I never met a Christian as a youngster who was nice to me. Never. Zero. Never. There was never they were all Catholic, I think, in Brooklyn that I encountered. They were either Hispanic, the Irish, whatever they were. None of them had anything nice to say, and none of them would ever. It was they wouldn't say good morning. I'd be happy with that. But they would beat you up, spit at you, curse you. Hitler should have finished you off. You killed Christ. Wow. I mean, that's just, that was all. The only reason why I nearly said it happened every day, but what you did as a child was you just knew that if you saw a bunch of non-Jews, you always crossed the street to the other side. You just wouldn't dare walk by. They always spit at you. And I really wondered as a youngster, what kind of world will I grow up in? Because the parents didn't act that way. Adults, their mothers and fathers didn't talk that way. The kids did. And I figured out pretty quickly that they're hearing this at home. They weren't born this way.
Of course,
Right.
yeah.
So in the house, the Jews are spoken of, but the kids don't have the filter to keep their mouths shut.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So where does that come from? So what happens is these Italian, Irish kids, or whatever they were, they hear all this crazy anti-Semitism at home, right? Their parents and grandparents, their uncles and aunts, who they get together with every Sunday, they say it among their own, but they wouldn't start screaming on the streets. But the children are unfiltered. So children simply regurgitate things that are impolite in the public. And it was so clear that I'm growing up in the world with these guys, these people are going to, it's very frightening. It was only later, it really blew my mind away, only in my 20s that I met Christians who were very nice people who came to my lectures, and that had a very big impact on me. That really was very transformative. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and in conclusion, I mean, as you know, Antioch, the hub of Gentile Christianity, right? Really like Paul's home base. And we see Ignatius, potentially first century, saying if you partake in the Passover, then you partook in killing Christ. And you're seeing that come to life with that story you just told. And that's, third, fourth generation Christianity. So it's clear that they're reading these texts. They had the New Testament, these bishops, right?
Yeah.
And they're reading the New Testament, and this is the exegesis of what they're getting, right? They're not reading into the text. This is simply just what they're getting from it. And like you just said, you were seeing it in real life, coming to life on the streets of New York,
Absolutely.
And that's, it's really such a sad story. I myself, I live in more of a rural Lutheran area.
How delightful.
Yeah. Another wonderful denomination for the
Lutheran.
Jews, right?
What a great denomination. Why?
But it's the same
so
thing.
Crazy,
Not a Jew around for miles, right? But you better believe, like on Easter Sunday, what the topic of conversation would be.
Right.
So it's so sad. It really is.
It's interesting
because there are good people that go to church on Sunday. And that's what really breaks my heart. Is because they're being conditioned to believe these things.
Ignatius is the person who introduces the idea that the Sabbath should be on Sunday. He's the one who's responsible for this. The Bishop of Antioch. Interestingly, fierce anti-Semite. The few non-Jews, Christians who are not anti-Semitic, I mean, in their heart, they really haven't. I think it happens because they meet Jewish people who disconfirm the anti-Semitism. Right. This is my theory. I'm just going to lay it out. I've never said this publicly. So people are exposed to all this anti-Semitism as a child, just hearing all this stuff, from mild things like Jew it down or the Jews controller. That's mild, So like, what happens? Like, how does somebody get out of that and reconsider it? And then there are people who are very philo-Semitic. What changed? Like, why? So what I think happens is that people grow up in that milieu in this Christian milieu, but then they actually meet a Jewish person. Mm-hmm. The physician who got rid of their whatever, operated the doctor, they met someone who's Jewish who doesn't act like that at all, who acts very differently than that.
Right.
And that, I think, disconfirmed that people go, wait, this Jewish person I just met, my doctor, this lawyer, this fellow I've met, whatever, is a very nice person I meet in public school. He's a nice boy. He doesn't fit that at all. And then people, I think, what happens is people then, it disconfirms, it undermines what they thought. Then they realize, oh, that's all garbage.
Right.
Actually, the Jews are not that way. And people meet. There were actually, you want to know something crazy? There were Christians like that in history. You know who was like that? Reuchlin. Johannine Reuchlin, he was in the early 16th century, early 1500s, a genius. He was a a genius. He was a German theologian and Hebraist, and he turned to the Jews to learn Hebrew. And apparently Jews were very nice to him because he became a champion for the Jews. It's a crazy. He's a very famous guy. He was a genius. He knew Hebrew cold. He was one of the rare geniuses. The Jews taught him. And in fact, he headed the chair universities in Germany. And in fact, what happened was there were apostate Jews in the early 1500s who were viciously, fiercely anti-Semitic, like Pfefferkorn as an example. Because even today, like you see on television, the most anti-Jewish people, the ones who attack us the most are Jews. So there were Jews who became Christians who wanted. The Jew is always much more anti-Jewish than because he's trying to prove himself. And it was interesting that Reuchlin, who was such a brilliant Christian scholar, that he supplied manuscripts for Erasmus to publish the first New Testament. So he was very philo-Semitic. And when Pfefferkorn and others said that the Jews have all these horrible things about Jesus in their Talmud, it was Reuchlin who was called upon by the church to investigate this because he could read Hebrew and Talmud. He knew all this stuff. And he was the one who defended the Jews and said, this is all nonsense, this is not true at all. And what these apostate Jews are saying about the Jews is a lie. He said, there's some weird pamphlets out there that say things about Jesus that are unflattering, but those are not authoritative texts. And this Reuchlin emerges as the great defender of the Jews. And in fact, he has in Germany other institutions for learning Hebrew. He wants to make sure that other Christians learn the Hebrew language. So there are odd champions that do emerge who emerge as philo-Semitic because they encounter Jews for themselves, realize that the caricature in the New Testament is not accurate, and reevaluate. And that's a very interesting story. I actually talk about this controversy of the Reuchlin-Pfefferkorn controversy. It's a big issue. And I go through that whole background, but that's a very interesting story. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Rabbi, that's really all the topics I have. If there are any,
you have more than that, but this is for our today.
Yeah. I know if there's any closing thoughts you may have, anything else you wanted to say, and
I want to just say this one thing, and that is I encourage you to just read the Hebrew Bible. You, the viewer, if you want to understand, like, if you're watching this because you just find this whole subject controversial and entertaining, it's one thing. But I presume you, the viewer, are curious about this because you believe in God and you just want to serve God in truth, right? You don't have to become an expert in the New Testament. Just read the Hebrew Bible. Just read it for yourself. Like, read it. It's there. It's really accessible. Read it. If you read the Hebrew Bible, none of this kind of Christian theology is going to make any sense to you at all. It's all you need to do. Right. Just know Tanakh. That's it. So thank you so much for having me on, Steve. A lot of blessings to you and your family.
Thank you so much.
And keep us in your prayers. Shalom.
Yes, we'll do. And in closing, everybody, as I said, please check that description. His 2-volume book set is there. We'll all appreciate it, and you're going to learn some very, very valuable information. So with that, Rabbi Tovia Singer, always a pleasure. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll see you next time, everybody.
Look forward to it. Be well.